Morning, everyone. Welcome to the final Places and Spaces update for the year. And today we're decking what are we decking the halls with? Something, decking the natural capital. We're doing something anyway today that's got a festive feel to it. Questions I can hear coming in saying, what presents have we got under the tree for you today? Well, let me tell you. As always, we've got the awesome planning lawyer, Beth Gascoigne. From Cripps. Client recently rang me and said what's really good about using Cripps is that you've got a fantastic planning team. It makes such a difference. So we're really pleased that Beth is here. Also, today is our regular Andy Black from Andy Black Consultants. Andy was described to me recently as the greatest jazz drumming planning consultant in the world ever. Always able to get you out of a snare and always keeps perfect timing and able to beat and keeps the beat in terms of the planning pulse. So there you go. We'll hear in a minute what we've got from them. Finally, special guest today, Simon Kennedy from Waite's Wildscapes. Really pleased that you can be with us here today, Simon. I'll be giving a bit more of an introduction to Simon later, and he's going to talk with us about some of the really interesting projects that he's been involved with and he's involved with going forward at the moment. Right, a busy hour. I've been told that no questions today, not because we don't like having questions, but because we've got a malfunction in the laptop department. So if that gets sorted in the next 5 or 10 minutes, I'll let you know and you can ask questions. But I do apologise for that. Before we go to Andy, who's going to give us a quick rundown on all things BNG, wanted to pick up just a couple of quite interesting points that are out there. Like a lot of people, I was at the LPDF planning conference recently, which was very good. A couple of things came up there which I think are important to highlight. And Nicole from Cripps is doing an update on one of these shortly, so look out for that. The first one was about the CJ Fry and Sons Limited case that went to the Supreme Court. Interesting decision in terms of the status of outline planning permissions. Interesting also that CJ Fry, who are I'm not going to call them tiny, but a relatively small family-run operation based down in Lytton Cheney, to keep my mother themes coming in, they are neighbours of her. So I know CJ Fry well. But interesting because it was a small developer taking on what they felt was a crazy decision in terms of not water neutrality, nitrate neutrality in Somerset, and the impact that had on an existing outline consent that they had. Anyway, Supreme Court has allowed their appeal, which gives, I think, as a general statement, it would say planning is king. And there may be some developments from that, but a key decision in terms of the importance of outline permissions. The second is, and we'll have to see how this develops in terms of its significance, is the new Section 106 agreements in standard form that are being adopted. Going to probably be significant for smaller schemes rather than large-scale bespoke schemes, but still a very interesting development. Right, Andy, biodiversity net gain. What have you got for us? I think you've got bees, you've got wasps, you've got all sorts today.
Everything, James. So I just wanted to go through and have a quick explainer on BNG. But I really want to talk about what is going to come next and what we might be expecting next year. So got a few slides I just wanted to run through. I think that most people on this seminar will know what we're talking about with BNG, but a very quick explainer to anyone that's not so familiar with the process. It was first brought in under the Environment Act in 2021. There's other parts of legislation that cover it, but essentially it's mandatory. It's not policy that's open to balance or interpretation. And the basic requirement is that you've got to deliver at least, and we'll come back to that, but at least 10% increase in biodiversity value relative to what's on the site, the pre-development biodiversity value of the on-site habitat. And you've got to do it really on-site. You can do it off-site or through credits as well. And that's been in play for a long time, but 2025 has been the first year where we've had that full year of kind of BNG in place and seeing how it works. You've really got to get an understanding of what's on the site in the first instance, and then consider how the 10% can be achieved. There are some small exemptions to where it's not required, so things like householder extensions, PD applications, Class Qs, Class MAs, self-build and custom build, Section 73s where a new permission is issued that didn't require BNG in the first place, and also there's a kind of exception for de minimis development, which is under 25 square meters of impact. But in reality, if you're wondering whether your project, your application needs BNG, it probably does, right? That's the starting point to look at. I've had one recently where BNG was applied to a Muga for an independent school. So it's, we didn't think it was going to be needed, but, the fact is it is. So that's kind of a very brief explainer. It also comes into play in terms of plan making as well. Paragraph 187 of the framework says that local plans need to provide for that net gain in biodiversity. And from this graph, most authorities now are proceeding or have already applied that 10% minimum amount. However, there are several that have gone beyond that requirement. A notable one I'm working in quite a lot is Mole Valley. Their plan says you've got to get to 20% minimum. So again, a really important part of all this is if you're starting a project, pick up the development plan, see what it says in that. Don't presume that it's 10%, because if you get to the point where you're putting your application in, you've done all your plans, and then it's 20%, it's a big difference. And in terms of when you're plan making, the planning practice guidance is very clear that you can seek that higher percentage. You've got to look at it in terms of justifying it. You've got to look at the viability of it and also how it's going to be implemented. But you're more than capable of doing that. So I think we're going to see, we know where we're at with new plans coming through, and it's going to be quite interesting to see who tries to go above and beyond that 10% BNG. There is a lot in terms of BNG. Go forward, in the planning practice guidance. It's worth looking at that. There's, as with other parts of the PPG, effectively it's a list of questions around things and around how it's going to be secured. There's a load of stuff in there around planning obligations and how you're going to secure that in terms of on-site or off-site management, although really you need a decent lawyer to work that through for you. Just moving through a bit more, alongside BNG, and it's really is kind of part of it and all wraps it up in it, is local nature recovery strategies. These were also created in the Environment Act, and effectively they're run by DEFRA. They've appointed these 48 responsible authorities that are going to cover the whole of England with no gaps or overlaps. And in many instances, that kind of effectively that area for the nature recovery strategy coincides with something like, in this instance, Surrey County Council is effectively that area. They put their consultation out in the summer for the local nature recovery strategy, and it really kind of starts to paint that broader picture of the strategy for the area, its biodiversity, the biodiversity priorities, the species priority list that are all set out. It's quite an interesting read. It really explains about, in terms of Surrey, what is it about Surrey in terms of biodiversity habitats that make it special? What are the priorities for improving that, and how that can all become important? And it's quite important as well because there's a link on this back into Greybelt, because Para 159 of the framework talks about where land has been identified as having a potential for habitat creation within a local nature recovery strategy, and proposals should contribute towards these outcomes. So as we see these local nature recovery strategies start to move towards a point of adoption, if you're looking at a Greybelt play in an authority, it's quite important to be hooking back into this and making sure that your Greybelt argument looks at how that's going to work. So it's a really important thing to be aware of these and where they're coming to. Also in the summer, DEFRA went out to consultation on improving the implementation of BNG for minor developments, for those that are under 10 units, or even talking about medium development, and also brownfield. We know that it can be quite difficult to get BNG onto a brownfield site for in an urban area, how that works and how you achieve that. And there was a lot of people pushing back to government on how that would work. And the consultation really set out a number of things around, should we have a wider exemption for all minor developments up to 9 units? Can you streamline that BNG process that you've got to go through in your metric for those smaller sites? Should we have a much more simple off-site provision that's almost a tariff-based system for BNG for small sites? So it's almost like a SIL kind of, or a roof tax in terms of units, and then looking at brownfield development. So at the time of writing, that's been out to consultation. We're waiting to see where the government might come back on that and what changes might happen. Also, at the time of writing, if it moves forward, Planning and Infrastructure Bill is right at its final knockings now. We're expecting it to be enacted maybe this year. I think this Parliament rises next week, so they've got a little bit of time.
Tuesday, I think.
It's next Tuesday. Yeah. So it might get done, if not in the very early new year. Initially, within the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, it was quite wide-ranging. There was quite radical plans around environmental delivery plans and nature restoration funds. A lot of that has been stripped out, but may well come back at the moment. But, worth, again, watching for once this becomes proper legislation, that secondary legislation that's going to come through, further guidance that might come through with that. Another interesting publication is back in October. There was the cross-party group, the Environment Audit Committee, and they produced this report, which was the Environmental Sustainability and Housing Growth. And what they were looking at is how you can tie the government target to build 1.5 million homes in the lifetime of this Parliament, how that can be achieved alongside committing to protection of natural environment and reversing those nature's decline effectively. And that committee heard evidence from a wide range of stakeholders, from developers, from councils, from lobby groups, many others. And you've got that kind of spectrum of opinion on this, and people that feel that protection of the environment is holding up the delivery of homes. There's too much of it. But there's going to be right the other end of the spectrum. People say that the protection of the environment is being set aside by government in order to achieve that growth. So it varies somewhere in between that spectrum. But one of the interesting conclusions in that is they were quite clear and it's quite a direct steer back to the Parliament from this group to say that the government must not veer down the path of viewing nature as an inconvenience or a blocker to house building. So they said in most cases, housing delivery is delayed or challenged due to unclear and conflicting policies. Correct. Land banking, that's not correct. And skill shortages, correct. Right. Using nature as a scapegoat means that the government will be less effective at tackling some of the genuine challenges that are facing the planning system. At worst, they said, this approach could lead to degradation of the natural world, preventing the achievement of legally binding climate and nature targets upon which our society and economy depends. So strong words from them back to Parliament and effectively saying, look, the two can still be made out. You can still do both things, but you've got to be careful around what you're doing and how you're doing it. So what next then for next year, for 2026? Well, I don't think we're going to see a walking away from B&G by any stretch. Quite the opposite. I think we'll see where things will go with local nature recovery strategies. I think we'll see more from the government on B&G. It'll be interesting to see where this ties in with local government reorganisation and how that might work with new local plans, spatial development strategies. We're due to see the NPPF this side of Christmas. We're due to see national development management policies. So it'll be quite interesting to see what they have to say about all of this. And I'm just going to end on this, James. So I picked up on a consultation. This is effectively a local group that have been set up. And there's a proposal within the Sevenoaks local plan to allocate land for 2,500 units and a new stadium for Wasps rugby team. And this is on the site of Pedden Place Golf Course in the AONB, in the Kent Downs AONB. And it's caused a lot of controversy, as you can imagine. This is the local group called Bees Not Wasps, which is quite a snappy title. And they're saying that they want nature, not Wasps Rugby Club coming on that site. But despite that snazzy title, well, there isn't much substance in their group in terms of ecological impacts of what the proposal would be. And actually, if you look at what Gladman are proposing, and I've got to say, I've no involvement in this. This is not a plug of one of my projects, but you can see that they are striving for a significant amount of B&G and habitat as part of those plans. So again, we've got this dichotomy and these people that from opposite ends. Exactly, bees and wasps is what I think you can achieve out of this. It's going to be a very interesting local plan examination. I'm involved in a couple of other sites in Sevenoaks, and I think this is where we can see the complexities of how all this is going to play. And I think it reminds me, James, I'm going to look it right back to the first track on the album that this podcast is named after, and that track is called Change Makes You Want to Hustle. Right? So couldn't that be truer than that ever? But I would say I prefer than that the often used quote by one of my heroes, Danish architect and planner Jan Gehl, and he said, "First life, then spaces, then buildings. The other way round never works." And I think that's what we need to be achieving for.
I think we can develop that. We can develop that further in programs going forward. But yes, first track on spaces and places is, as you say. I do love the wasps and bees story, and it reminds me of Ray Wilkins, who was a fantastic footballer for Arsenal, Inter Milan in England. Was manager at QPR during the I think probably early 2000s. And QPR, and this is one of the problems that Wasps Rugby Club had, they were stadium-less, and they shared the QPR stadium for a period of time. So Ray Wilkins was asked, what's it like sharing the stadium with Wasps Rugby Football Club? And he said, in a very deadpan answer, "Oh, it's really good. It's really created a buzz around the place." So always makes me giggle. So B&G is here to stay. Andy, B&G's easy. Plants and trees. Bob's your uncle. Why are you making such a fuss about it?
If only.
If only. We'll come to Simon on that a bit later in terms of B&G is easy. I think that can be a theme of it. Thank you. Really good. And we will be following up in 26 with some of the points that you've highlighted this morning. Looking back to something we talked about at the beginning of the year, may have been at the end of last year, and it was with Steve O'Halloran from Reside Developments. We were looking at water neutrality principally in the Horsham District Council and Chichester areas. Obviously, big changes in the last 3 months there, and some of the implications. Or it's quite interesting to look at what are the implications of the changes that came out end of October, and to talk us through that this morning, Beth, you're going to pick up some subtle things that you've been looking at as a result of the announcement in October.
That's right. This is me. And yeah, I'm going to take a quick look at the implication for schemes, those already in the system, but also those that may be coming forward in Horsham, Crawley and parts of Chichester that fall within Southern Water's Sussex North Water Resource Zone, and particularly following the withdrawal of Natural England's 2021 water neutrality position statement. So the plan is to start with a quick recap, if I can make the slides catch up with me. Oh yeah, here we go. So let me take you back. September 2021, Natural England published a position statement stating that it could not, with certainty, conclude that Southern Water's abstraction in the area was not having an adverse effect on the integrity of protected habitats in the Arun Valley. And living within those habitats was a rare snail species, which ended up getting brought to the front of the debate. The issue on the legal side stems from the habitat regs, which state that any plan or project, including housing or commercial development, that may affect internationally protected sites must undergo a habitat regs assessment. And in order to comply with the habitat regs, any new development that would get its water from Southern Water's Sussex North Water Resource Zone had to demonstrate, before it could be granted consent, that the level of water use on the site after the development has taken place would be the same as it was before the development occurred. So as you can imagine, for most schemes, particularly if they're schemes which are going to be new development on fields, previously undeveloped sites, was quite hard to do, and effectively put an immediate stop on the approval of planning applications for any new development in the area, unless they could demonstrate what essentially everyone then started to refer to as water neutrality. And that became the snails versus homes debate. So how has it been and how was it being dealt with? To date, most permissions granted in the area have either been because they have secured some particularly bespoke offsetting measures, and we've been involved with a number of quite elaborate schemes, haven't we? We've had retrofitting water-saving measures, so for example, developers entering into obligations to essentially improve the water, limit the water consumption within existing housing stock, so retrofitting water-saving measures to some affordable housing stock. We've had water-saving measures on water-intensive off-site developments, and so the example of the brewery, where the water was used for, is it washing the grain? I can't remember the detail of it. Bottles. Anyway, there was a process which would change, which would involve a significant reduction in water use. We've had water saving measures, or water harvesting, water collection, so agricultural buildings, rainwater harvesting, that sort of thing. So we've had some quite creative off-site measures that have been secured through legal agreements, and as you can imagine, increasingly complex drafting and negotiations around those. We've also have situations where consents have been subject to grampian conditions, so preventing occupation until water neutrality is secured. And that may be that there isn't a scheme or a project that the developer's aware of at the time consent's granted, but before they can commence development, there's a requirement to either purchase credits, which would essentially pay for mitigation, or a number of schemes actually were waiting on the launch of the, I would call it SNOWS, but now it's the Sussex North Water Certification Scheme, which was an offsetting scheme that Horsham District Council were bringing forward. All of which has inevitably delayed projects over the past years and added quite considerable cost in areas of the county with significant housing need as well. So that's the background. So what's happened, and the reason why we're talking about this now is, so the burden of dealing with the issue has fallen, I think, within the remit of the planning system, and the controls that have been there have naturally been borne by the development industry. But on the 8th of October, the government announced that an agreement had been reached between DEFRA RSPB, Southern Water and Natural England on new guidelines to protect the wetlands and the wildlife, while new homes that fall essentially within the Sussex North Water Resource Zone can be built. And Southern Water have agreed at their own cost to limit the amount of water taken from the wetlands and rivers in the area, to cut down on leaks, to investigate new water resources, to provide funding for habitat restoration, and in addition to change its water abstraction permits, which would essentially limit the levels of abstraction. The government statement that came alongside this referred to 4,000 previously stored homes, which could now proceed, and the unlocking of 17,000 additional new homes. So following the announcement, a number of holding statements were released by the affected authorities, saying various things. It wasn't completely clear from the initial statement what the position was going to be and how quickly the changes could be made. But on the 31st of October, Natural England formally withdrew its 2021 water neutrality position statement, which meant that development within the area was no longer required to demonstrate via a water neutrality statement that it would be water neutral. So that's the change. And in terms of how it's being dealt with, we have got a number of new considerations. Authorities have begun issuing decisions on live applications that have been held up by water neutrality. I'll start with the easiest position, which is for new applications. And this has been significantly simplified by the change. So there's no longer a requirement for a water neutrality statement. There's no payment being required for any off-site water neutrality solutions. There's no requirement for bespoke conditions or a Section 106 obligation, which would be required to demonstrate or secure water neutrality. And the Horsham scheme as well, that was coming forward to provide a solution to this, the credits offsetting scheme, is no longer due to be launched. In terms of the detail behind this, the relevant authorities still remain the competent authority under the Habitats Regs and must be assured still that the southern water mitigation that's proposed will be effective and suitably secured. It's just worth noting that given the licence change has not yet taken place, and I think it's expected in spring next year, it will be necessary to ensure continued compliance with the Habitats Regs. So officers will continue to undertake an appropriate assessment of the development of any proposals that come forward as part of their overall considerations. So the practicalities. The practicalities of this. For applicants who have an application already in the system or an existing planning permission with conditions and Section 106 obligations which require compliance with perhaps quite bespoke water neutrality mitigation, the situation is slightly more complex than those now in a position where they could submit new applications going forward. If I start with those consents which are already granted, the Council are considering applications under Section 73 to remove any conditions and any associated applications to vary or discharge relevant Section 106 obligations. It's likely that the water neutrality condition, if it is varied and when it's varied, will likely be replaced by a new simpler condition which requires compliance with a water use standard. I think, the reference I've got is 110 litres per person per dwelling. I think it's in building regs anyway. And essentially, I think this condition is the same as that was being applied to new dwellings prior to the 2021 position statement. So we're just reverting back to the position that they were applying before. If water neutrality was not secured by condition, but by bespoke drafting in the Section 106, it will be necessary to agree a variation with the Council. There are a number of considerations that sit alongside that. So, for example, a number of the 106s that we dealt with, it wasn't just obligations on the part of the landowner or developer, but there was another third-party landowner involved, essentially the water mitigation landowner, who was also party to the Section 106. So you're coming to a situation where you're looking to vary an existing Section 106, and it may be that you've got a number of parties who are going to need to agree to that variation and sign that document. It may be that there's some room for negotiation. It's possible that because it's not a county matter, to the extent that it's their decision making, they may not be required to be a party, although we've not had these discussions with any of the relevant authorities yet. But either way, these variations are going to take some time to go through the system. In addition to that, and James, this is kind of where you come in on the property side, notwithstanding any variation to the Section 106, it's also necessary to check any contractual documents which sit behind the Section 106 with regard to securing the water mitigation provisions. And I know that you've advised on a number during the past few years and have revisited those to see what kind of obligations there may be going forward as a consequence. And
we used the notion of a relevant event occurring, which allowed for a termination of the agreement. And actually, that was something that I stole from what you were doing with the nitrates in the Solent in terms of a relevant event, and we'll come to that in a minute. But yeah, it's complicated. And the 106 position is complex, particularly where you have water off-site solution landowners being party to the 106. Not straightforward.
No, it's not. And it's not also necessarily automatic, because the planning policy position has changed, that the contractual position can follow through. And it may be that there are still payments which are due and commitments that will need to be reassessed.
And you've got a time issue as well in terms of the just to run through the Section 73 application, and then you'll have a JR period on that. It's a challenge.
That's a challenge, and actually I think it's one that's being grappled with currently for applications which are still in the system. So the relevant councils have suggested that undetermined applications that have already been heard by committee would either need to be returned to committee so that the draft conditions with regard to water neutrality could be amended, or alternatively the suggestion is that the application could be approved in its current form, so post-committee resolution, and then the consent is bagged and you go back then and obtain a Section 73 application to vary the relevant conditions and obligations.
I guess you've got to look at that on a case-by-case basis and from a strategy perspective, look at the permission that you, as you say, you might well have bagged and make decisions as to whether or not you go back to committee or don't go back to committee.
Well, I think there are risks. And I mean, we've looked at it, we've kind of unpicked it in quite detailed fashion, actually, because a lot of these relate to timing implications and and they have knock-on effects for property transactions and related deals. But we've looked at whether or not actually, firstly, it is correct, and are the council saying it has to go back to committee? Is that right? Do officers have the ability to amend the relevant condition under delegated powers? Going back to committee, as you say, is unattractive because it delays the decision, and it also just impacts on wider timescales going forward. There's helpful case law if you did want to look at it on making delegated decisions that might be worth considering. I mean, essentially, there's no prejudice for members not getting the decision back to them. It's a fact of law that these situations have changed. There's no discretion for members in terms of the decision they could make. They're essentially interpreting the change in policy position. However, you sitting alongside that, trying to persuade officers and councillors that they can make a delegated decision could take as much time as it would perhaps do to go back to the next committee meeting. I mean, if you're being offered, in the next month's committee, it could be an easier.
Well, it depends on how long the delay's been. So it could range from your shelf life of your ecology surveys being deemed to be out, or if you've got an EIA accompanying that application, looking at cumulative committed developments within that have happened since you've written the EIA. So you've got to go and look at rescoping that. So there's a number of other things that could lead into that. If you've got a stalled application that then goes back to committee. Yeah.
Well, that's the thing, and they all need to be weighed into the balance. Essentially, the other approach, which is that you get your consent and then you look at any necessary changes afterwards. The concern is that it may leave your consent open to challenge. The decision needs to be correct at the date it's made. And so if a decision is being made on a draft condition which contains a water neutrality condition, which is no longer required, means that perhaps that decision isn't correct at the point at which it's granted. And in terms of then making any variations, we're in a situation now where Natural England are clear there is no longer a requirement. So what will have changed if you're looking to justify your Section 73 application and your decision was granted on the basis that there wasn't a requirement anyway for water neutrality, the condition was just in there. There still is no requirement for water neutrality at the point at which you go for your Section 73 application. What's the justification? Basically nothing. So again, there's another decision and you're kicking it down the line as well. So you've got another decision, another potential JR period, another risk of challenge that means that you're still looking at a period of uncertainty, which has knock-on effects. If you're looking to sell your site, if other interests are involved in the site, there isn't a point at which they know that consent is safe. Oh, hang on. See if I've missed. Oh no, that's fine. I haven't missed anything. So there's a lot to consider still. And I think on the positive side, the changes have resulted in a simplification of the process to obtain planning consent. So new consents going in, I think it's a lot more straightforward. However, problems around water stress, water pollution are going to continue to arise across the country. I was looking at extracts from the Cunliffe Review of the water sector, which was published a while back, I think over the summer, and it concluded that essentially reform of our entire water system is required. It's an epic task, and I think the consequence of that is that likely the planning system will continue, at least for the foreseeable future, to be used to address the failures in our water system. So despite, I think, can't read my table. I think what it shows, the table shows two sectors which are responsible for the greatest levels of water pollution. Is it agriculture and the water industry itself, both of which sit largely outside the control of the planning system. So with that in mind, I think the practical takeaway is for the next before the next requirement for water-based mitigation arises, wherever that may be, is to ensure that as you go through the process of drafting any relevant conditions or Section 106 obligations, or indeed the contractual documentation that may be required to sit behind it, is that there needs to be as much flexibility as possible included in those to allow for policy and position changes, which can occur rapidly and quite often when least expected.
Yeah, I mean, an evolving and developing area. I mean, the plug has been pulled, but maybe the water's not fully drained out of the bath on that issue. I think it still remains live and still needs careful thought and consideration in terms of, from a strategy perspective, in terms of how you would approach an existing permission. New permissions fairly clear, but existing permissions much more complicated. Thanks, Beth. I made a reference to nitrates, and you can Simon will tell us a little bit in a moment about that. But we're really pleased to have you here today. You are an associate director from Waits Wildscapes. You are a strange breed in that you're an environmental scientist and a planner, and a lot more as well. And you've got a very unique kind of approach and take on natural capital issues and natural capital matters, and how nature links in with development. So, give me a bit of background as to how you are where you are. In terms of what's led you to the position that you currently hold at Waits, and we'll talk then a little bit more about some of the things that you're doing with Waits. But so give me a little bit of give me a bit of your background.
Thanks, James. I'll start when I was 7, if I may. And frankly, my whole life has been thinking about concepts around sustainable development, and the reason I start at 7 is my father was actually very heavily involved in residential development. He was commercial and technical director for many of the larger house builders, and I remember very vividly, kind of while I was in junior school, flying back from a holiday with him and him looking down from the plane and saying, look at all of this green space, it's ridiculous, there's loads of space to build, struggling with getting the sites away, getting permissions for his sites, from his job as a developer. And he was right. You look down and there's very little development and lots of rural space. But at the same time, I had a primary school teacher, and she was, this was in the late 80s, so she was quite progressive in this way. She was a member of Greenpeace and was very keen to let her students know that, humans have an impact on the earth and our environment and everything around us. And, sometimes that's bad and we've got to think about that. And those two things kind of happened at the same time. And I remember going, with my dad and him saying, there's all this space, and me thinking, well, there is. And absolutely, we've got to have new homes and we've got to, have a society that can grow and advance. But we've got to do it in the right way. And it kind of started there. And, that led all the way from junior school up through to university. And as you say, I did my undergraduate degree in environmental science, which gave me a really good understanding of how these kind of water systems, nutrient cycles, how nature operates in life, and, empirical evidence about how that is changing and how that is impacted by development. So when I did my undergraduate degree, I very much focused on concepts around sustainable development and how they work. Shortly after that, went to work actually for Barratt Homes for a short while, doing contract management, and used that environmental science knowledge in site selection and constraints analysis as a land buyer for Barratt Homes. Unfortunately, that was early 2000s, and all land teams at that stage got made redundant. And I went off and operated in a number of other industries, but that was really useful as well in this new natural capital market, because natural capital is all new to everybody, and you've got to be able to use sort of concepts and ideas from lots of different places and bring them all together. And that's what planning does as well, obviously, to a certain extent. So after, as I say, some time out of development and out of the environment, I came back and secured a job in development management in a local planning authority. And I'll name them because they were very kind and funded a master's in planning. And it was, again, really interesting. I spent a lot of time in development management discharging planning conditions. And they're all about how development interacts with the environment. And, that was such a useful process, discharging planning conditions, to really understand the system and how the interaction between buildings and the world around the buildings really works. And obviously, because of my experience in environmental science, kind of gravitated towards the more environmental policies. So things like source protection zones for water abstraction. We get a lot of that in Chichester is kind of related to water neutrality and nutrient neutrality. And, how do we make sure that our development isn't polluting our possible water supply? These are really important things, that we've got to understand. And, as you might imagine, I moved from development management into policy. And actually, I was in the very first meeting in the Solent where Natural England came along. The thing about the Solent area is it's got a real benefit in spatial planning terms. They've got an organisation called the Partnership for South Hampshire, which essentially brings all of the local authorities together to talk about spatial issues that cross their boundaries. And as part of that, there was a water quality working group. And I very vividly remember being in my policy role and going to one of these water quality working groups. I was the council rep on that group, and there's about 4 council turned up to it, and Natural England came along and said, right, there's been some case law over in Europe, and we think you've got a massive problem, and as a competent authority, we think this means you can't grant any more planning permissions until you've solved this problem and made sure that development can mitigate its impacts on nutrients. And
this was nitrates, was it?
Yeah, not nitrogen. Yes. And you can imagine that a meeting a month later, there was about 300 people in that meeting. Chief executives, heads of planning, the whole lot. So I was actually there at the very beginning of the Solent's kind of issue of nutrient neutrality, and what became clear was to local authorities is with these spatial issues that cover a number of local authority areas, you really need a central point of contact. You need somebody that can look across all of those areas and come up with strategic solutions across those areas. So again, one of the great benefits and why the Solent was so successful in resolving the nutrient problem was because they were already used to coming together and working strategically outside of their administrative areas. So they created a position to respond to nutrient neutrality. I applied for that position and became the point person for the local authorities. And, that was my true entry into natural capital, and spent a good couple of years there, working through all of these issues, the legals and so on and so forth. And obviously, towards the end of that, it segued quite cleanly into biodiversity net gain. Some very stark differences between the two, but quite a lot of similarities as well. What's really interesting is, in terms of the lead up to where I am now is, it's the breadth of understanding of all of these natural capital and environmental services markets that development needs in different areas. We've talked about water neutrality, we've talked about biodiversity net gain, we've talked about nutrient neutrality. We did also quite a lot of recreational disturbance work as well, protecting the impact of increased levels of people on particularly sensitive sites. And, again, these all have their own considerations, their own policy objectives, their own legislative frameworks, and sometimes the bodies are meeting in a different way. So after all of that experience, it was clear that these natural capital markets really benefit from a really strong commercial understanding, a really strong understanding of environmental systems and how they actually work in practice. And obviously in relation to development, how development works and how the planning process works. So I was really lucky to have all of that, and Wates were interested in getting into the natural capital world, and that's how we got to here. So
I mean, that leads into a thought or question about responsibility for dealing with some of the issues that you've talked about. Should that lie with government? Should that lie with commercial entities? Where's the balance there? Where does the responsibility lie, or where should it lie, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of different answers there, because you could say that the responsibility should lie, with government, and that they should potentially use levies or taxes, much as it is being described in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, to deliver these services to the development industry. However, my experience tells me that has not been effective over 20 or 30 years worth of government work in this area. There's certainly been massive advancements, but we've seen in many nutrient neutrality areas, we've seen in water neutrality, government hasn't generally been able to react quick enough, be slick enough, have enough incentive to deliver these solutions really, really quickly. And also traditionally, it's been much from the public purse. It comes from wider taxes into environmental schemes. So I've sat on both sides of this fence. I've delivered schemes from a public perspective, working for the local authorities, and from a private perspective. And, ultimately, the results are the same, but the private sector does it more quickly, more efficiently, and has that sense of urgency that you often just don't get from, the statutory bodies. So there is some argument that, in a big state world, and I think this is where Labour are definitely kind of trying to point the direction of this now, it would go into the public bodies. But as I say, my experience, and specifically my experience with nutrients, in the Solent area, is the private market just does it more quickly, more effectively, and delivers the same results. Just a little example of this, because it came out from a Freedom of Information request just recently. When nutrients was a problem and was hitting all of the headlines, the Solent was only really one of the only places that had delivered a solution at that time that unblocked development, and a lot of the other areas were still struggling. So
we talked about Somerset earlier, and the CJ Pride case. That was caught up with exactly the delays you're talking about.
Yes, exactly that. So government turned around and said, "Well, okay, look, some of these authorities aren't quite getting there. We need to push this forward. We're going to through Natural England, we're going to come up with a team, and we're going to give them some money from Treasury to push forward solutions elsewhere. So I think the Freedom of Information request suggested that they had just over £30 million worth of funding, and they delivered one scheme in the Tees catchment that unlocked a small fraction of the actual development need that was needed. So on one hand, you have public money, £30 million, public body, Natural England, or arm's length public body in Natural England, being given £30 million of public money, and over a space of 2 years delivering, I can't remember the exact figure, a few hundred kilograms worth of mitigation, which unlocked a few hundred homes to 1,000 homes, which was a very small proportion of the amount of homes that had been unlocked. In the same period in the Solent, using a very small amount of money, essentially the money to fund my position and then the time of officers across the local planning authorities, we facilitated a system that allowed private investment in 12 separate schemes that delivered mitigation for over 10,000 homes. So for £100,000, the private market of public money, the private market delivered a solution much more quickly that solved much more of the problem with £30 million. So that's the example I use. I won't get into where does it ideologically lie better, public, but my experience tells me that the private investment can do this much better.
I made reference to the LPDF conference that was a couple of weeks ago, and an interesting theme that came out of one of the discussions there was the statement that nature needs development, that nature actually benefits from development taking place, and the discussion was around the importance of taking control of that narrative, which is what you just outlined now, and how important that is going to be for nature going forward. And I think that's an interesting idea. Maybe not a catchy headline, nature needs development, but you can see the consequences just from that illustration that you highlighted. What are the blocks? I mean, you when we talk about BNG, you'll see BNG talking about a 30-year BNG program. Andy alluded to it a little bit earlier. We have 5-year legislative terms. Andy said BNG is here to stay, but planning for dealing with BNG from a commercial perspective can be quite difficult because of the BNG needs time, but policy can change. How are you finding the commercial world respond to that difficulty?
With great difficulty, and it, to a certain extent, again, there's a couple of aspects to this. When we're talking about kind of blockers and challenges, the biggest one is government policy change. In terms of investment profiles and business cases to bring this solution forward to aid development, it's got to be commercially sound. And the whole purpose of the biodiversity net gain legislation and how it was rolled out was to create that system where it was financially sound. And let's be absolutely clear, it's a mandatory legal requirement. So that's what has driven so much investment into this market. That there is a customer there at the end of it. Or do we? Is the issue that we're now coming across. Because, and again, I saw it in nutrients, and it's really depressing watching the political lobbying battle play out and having to sit underneath that. I tried to influence it as best I can, and certainly did through nutrients, but the sector, the natural capital, and we deliver environmental services to the development industry is what we do. We take that natural capital, and the whole industry has been saying for a long time, just stop moving the goalposts for 5 minutes, please. I used to joke for nutrients, I just put in a calendar entry every 3 months, government trying to mess with things, and and that's what it was like, and it's being exactly the same for biodiversity net gain. So when I'm reporting on these projects that we're looking to invest in, it's this project might take 5 years to sell all of these units. Are we going to still have this policy, next year? And if we still have the policy, what's it going to look like? We've been talking about the exemptions. There's a lot on LinkedIn at the moment about the impacts of the exemptions, further exemptions from B&G might have on the market. And sitting on the commercial side, absolutely. That is, if you're saying the market is 10 big, and you're taking and you've done all of your modelling on the market having 10 customers, and then somebody comes in and says, sorry, you can't sell to these 3 anymore because we're deciding to exempt them, everything changes. And I'll just be absolutely frank on this, that it was just far too soon. And this is the problem with that political cycle and the lobbying and so on and so forth. I used to talk, developers do grumble, clearly. There's an extra cost line. It's an extra effort line. It's much harder for SMEs at the moment. But, we're 18 months in. All new policies of this size and this scale take some time to bed in, everybody to get used to them and move forward. So, one of the biggest blockers for all environmental policy and how we can deal with this effectively moving forward is just a period of stability and certainty. And if we don't have that, we can't invest. So therefore, if you're not exempt, where are your B&G units coming from? Because nobody's providing them anymore. And, it's very simple. It's, that concept is very simple. If you take away the market, we'll stop investing and then the whole thing collapses. And I very much hope that government, it's this week, they're thinking about what they're going to do with this. There's a lot of lobbying going on, but it's by far the biggest blocker. And the only other real blocker is then how can how much development can come forward to do it. And as you said just a moment ago, for me, I want as much growth and development now because it will generate so much environmental gains that simply weren't happening 18 months ago, just weren't in the system. Yeah. There was no mechanism that just simply wouldn't have happened. And it's such an amazing thing. Our country is so desperate to have, some space for nature, a safe space where nature can go. So the big blockers are not enough growth, frankly. If you want nature in this country at the moment with this legislation, then we've got to drive growth as quickly as we can, and government has got to give us 5 minutes to get on with it and show that it can work. So government is frankly the biggest blocker.
I think what's interesting is that Wates, who obviously really important promoter, developer, construction company, have embraced this. And see the benefit of what you are describing, and I think that's fantastic. What I'd like to hear about, you haven't been in the post long, but already you've got some pretty good live examples that are underway that are doing exactly what you've just been talking about and exactly what you've just described.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, again, as I say, I haven't been there for very long. February I joined Wates, but it's worth commenting that when nutrient neutrality was happening, House Builders Federation had a round table up in London. A whole bunch of developers came along to talk about the issues of nutrient neutrality. And they were all kind of bemoaning how difficult it is. And I remember saying to the group, fell on deaf ears at the time, but I remember saying to the group, you're really well placed to deal with this as a developer. You understand contracting, you know what you need, you know how to buy land, you know how to deliver these solutions. And I just say, Wates is a family-owned business. It's been, absolutely amazing to see how they live this purpose of having a responsibility to look at that more sustainable future, and it's been fantastic. So, they've
give us some examples. Come on.
Yeah,
I know we've got Tunbridge Wells. Give us a Tunbridge Wells.
So they've invested heavily. We own a site in Tunbridge Wells. We own it freehold. We are imminently just about to have it registered on the Natural England website. It's probably just going to flick into January now. Fascinating site on a river in a floodplain. And, the work we're doing in Wates isn't just trying to do the simple, easy stuff. We're trying to do stuff that really fits in. So we've got some wet woodland on there. We're improving the quality of the Medway River. And we're really trying to deliver a scheme that fits into the environment rather than just creates a commercial return. Although, of course, it is due to create a commercial return as well. So that planting is happening on that site at the moment. It's really exciting when we go down there and see it change. So that is a marginal piece of farmland taken out of farming production. It was grade 3 agricultural land in the flood zone, and we're in the process of creating this great habitat on there. And again, we're selling those biodiversity net gain units into the high wheeled market in that part of the world. And it's a really fascinating site, really quite technically complex, but all the more rewarding for that, frankly. So it's amazing. And you go into a community, and as I say, I've been planners, I've done local plan consultations. You normally go into a community, in somewhere like Tunbridge Wells, very small village, and you say, so we've just bought this big bit of land here, and the pitchforks come out generally. And the great thing about working in natural capital is we go into these areas with a B&G scheme or an environmental scheme. We say, Waits have bought this, piece of land. They start together, and we say, and we're going to turn it into, a haven for nature. And they all suddenly become much more friendly. It's just received. The public really appreciates the need for this. So, yeah, we've got this site in Tunbridge Wells, High Weald catchment. We've got one coming forward in the spring. That's in Wiltshire. Also provides Stacks environmental services. So we're going to provide biodiversity net gain units from that site, but also nutrient neutrality mitigation for the Hampshire Avon catchment. And then 2 more in the pipeline in the Midlands, one near Kettering and one near Maldon. So, really exciting time, really investing heavily. Sites coming through, available to sell for anybody out there that needs any biodiversity net gain units. And it's a fascinating time to be involved in this.
Good. Okay, a lot more to come on that, and we'll have you back on future programmes in terms of some updates on what you've been up to. So if you come back on that, that'd be really good. And I'm really interested in that policy position in terms of the importance of being able to make concrete plans for concrete. There we go. Concrete plans for protecting nature when you're battling against policy changes that can come every 3 months, as you describe. Really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time. Right, I think that's it. I think that's it for today. I think that's it for, what year are we? 2025. We've had some fun this year. We had some interesting programs. Lots planned for next year. I'm interested in that announcement about development near train stations and hubs. I don't know why I'm obsessing about that one, but I am. But we've got more to come in the new year, and hope everyone will join us for that. But I think all we can do now is a ho ho ho, and happy Christmas, everyone. Thanks for listening in, and we'll catch you in the beginning of 2026.